Hello, I'm Tony Cordato. I'm a real estate lawyer, which means I look after property transactions such as buying and selling, mortgages, leases, strata title, and one of my favourites, vendor finance for real estate. Now this talk is part one of a 5-part explainer series called The Keys to Vendor Finance for Real Estate in Australia. This is the introduction. When I think of vendor finance, I think of visiting a cake shop. At a cake shop, you can buy a whole cake or buy a cake slice by slice. You'd agree with me that if you buy slice by slice, it's more affordable than buying the whole cake. Oh, hello Tony.
Good morning. How are you?
Pretty good.
What can I do for you today?
Now, I'd like a bit of cake.
You have a great selection.
Yeah, well, you know what? That one there looks good.
It is very good. That one there is actually $68.
It's a $68 cake.
Correct.
Oh, I don't know if I've got all the money for that at the moment.
Okay, I tell you what, I can sell you a slice for $8 each.
Okay, I have $8, so that means that I can have a slice today and maybe one tomorrow, instead of saving up for 8 days to buy the whole cake.
Oh, that sounds like a plan. Take a seat and I'll bring it out to you.
Excellent.
Thanks,
Tony.
Here you go, Tony.
Looks delicious. Wow.
It does.
You know, it goes to show that old saying is wrong. The saying about you can't have your cake and eat it too.
You know what? That's right. You can have your cake eaten too.
If you eat it by the slice.
Absolutely. Enjoy.
Thank you. Same with vendor finance. The purchaser pays the price slice by slice by instalments. Now, normally when people buy a house, you pay the vendor in cash. Now, I don't mean a stack of $100 bills. I mean in money, which is provided part through a deposit and majority part through a bank loan or other financier. The bank offers finance, and that's the standard model used in Australia at the moment. It was different 100 years ago. 100 years ago, land and houses were sold with vendor finance. They called it terms finance, and you pay by easy terms. Now, why do you think sellers did that 100 years ago? Well, because if you offered terms instead of asking for the full price to be paid in cash, there were many more purchasers you could attract to purchase the property. And because the banks were not interested in lending money to purchase residential property, unless the vendors offered vendor finance, there'd be very few people turn up to the auction of the property. So, 100 years ago, vendors, particularly subdividers, offered easy terms where you could pay a deposit and the price over a few years with interest. Now, let's look at some examples which are provided to us by the State Library of New South Wales. They're posters for sale of property in subdivisions in and around Sydney. Well, let's start with the Radium Estate at Arncliffe, which was subdivided in 1910. Let's concentrate on the terms. The terms were purchasers paid £1 deposit and £1, which is 20 shillings per month, until the land was paid for. Interest was added at 4% per annum. It might take 2-3 years to pay off the land. If you had cash up front, you received a 5% discount. So you pay a little more for the land if you pay with easy terms, but it's affordable. Now let's head to Maroubra. Don't you love the beach babe on the right-hand side of the poster in her red dress and red headscarf? Well, in 1918, you could buy land near Maroubra Beach from the government on a Crown land sale with a 25% deposit. Now, some of the land was only £4. So, if you paid £1 when you signed the contract and paid £1 per year over the next 3 years and paid interest at 5%, you'd have your block of land at Maroubra. Now, you've all heard of Bondi Beach. In 1923, you could buy land close to Bondi Beach. Look at the poster, the easy terms. Purchasers paid a 10% deposit and could pay the balance over 5 years by 20 equal quarterly payments with 5% interest added. If only your grandfather had bought that block of land, they'd be worth more than $3 million today. Land was still selling with easy terms in the 1960s. This is an advertisement for land for sale at Kiama Heights on the south coast. The land was priced from £65 with 3 years terms. Times had changed for beach babes. They wore polka dot bikinis. Now, what do these posters tell us about vendor finance? Well, number one, there was always a deposit. 10% up to 25%. Number two, the terms payments were over 3, 4 or 5 years. Number three, the purchasers paid interest at either 4% or 5% per annum. And number four, if you paid cash, instead of taking the terms, you had a 5% discount. Vendor finance is still used in Australia to sell property, but not the same way as it was used 100 years ago. And that's because the banks are very willing to lend money on houses and house and land packages. So today, a purchaser saves up 10, maybe 20%, and the bank or non-bank will lend the other 80%. But not all properties are suitable for bank finance. They may be apartments, there may be properties in rural areas, it may be a commercial property. Banks are very choosy about those kinds of properties, and to sell the property, the vendor has to give some form of vendor finance. Now, this talk will be about an introduction to 4 kinds of vendor finance that a vendor can use for properties that are not easy to sell and for properties that are easy to sell in the good times but more difficult to sell in the hard times. Now, the 4 kinds of vendor finance I'll be talking about are delayed settlement, carryback loans, instalment contracts, and rent to own. Delayed settlement. Well, everybody who purchases an apartment off the plan is being given delayed settlement terms by the seller. They pay 10% deposit now, wait 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years for the apartment block to be finished, and pay the other 90% with a bank loan. That's a delayed settlement contract. Delayed settlement contracts are also useful for people who have a property that may take time to sell and suit a purchaser who needs a bit more time to purchase. Now, when I'm saying more time, I mean more than 90 days. And it may suit a seller, a vendor, to have 6 months or a year so that they can organise themselves, perhaps wind down their business, perhaps complete the purchase, building of another property, and to live in that property for maybe 12 months before they have to move out and the purchaser pays the rest of the price. So in those situations, the purchaser will pay 10%, and then 12 months later will pay the 90%, and the vendor will stay in the property, keep making the mortgage payments, keep looking after the property until the time comes for settlement. That's a delayed settlement contract. The second type of vendor finance is a carryback loan. Well, what happens if come settlement time, or perhaps earlier, come finance time, the purchaser is told by their bank, well, look, we're only lending you 80%. We know you have 10%, so there'll be a gap, a 10% gap between what we're prepared to lend you and what you have available. A purchaser in that situation has two sources of finance. Number one, the bank of mum and dad, who might lend them the 10% they're missing. Or the vendor, who can lend them the 10% they're missing as what's known as a carryback loan, which is payable over, you guessed it, 2, 3, 4 or 5 years. The third form of vendor finance is more for the professionals. It's called an instalment contract. And in an instalment contract, the purchaser pays a deposit and is allowed to move in, paying off the price by instalments over what looks like a bank loan, 25 or 30 years. And of course, they won't keep paying for 25 or 30 years. At some point, they'll have enough equity in the property to refinance. But that reminds you of the cake shop, doesn't it? Where people pay off the property slice by slice. The fourth kind is, again, for the professionals, but it's more beginner. It's called rent to own. In a rent to own, a purchaser rents the property over a period of years, 2, 3 years, with the idea that they pay a little bit extra over and above the rent, and that extra goes to build up a deposit. So over 2, 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 years, they'll have built up perhaps a 10% deposit. The bank will lend them 70, 75, 80%, and the vendor will say, look, I'm happy to give you a carryback loan for the difference so that you can buy the house outright in your name. That's rent to own. So, we've gone through the 4 forms of vendor finance: the delayed completion, the carryback loan, instalment contracts and rent to own. Each of them has a separate video, so if you want to learn more about them, go to the separate video where I give you more explanation, an example and the rules that apply. Now, before I go, the last 2, instalment contracts and rent to own, are not suitable for use in Victoria or South Australia, but they can be used everywhere else in Australia. If you want some written explanation, go to my website, which is www.vendorfinancelawyer.com.au. And I hope you get to love vendor finance as much as I do.